All right, so we're still talking about our aim. How did Mao try to turn China into a communist society? And I fixed the numbers on my PowerPoint, so we're up to this question. Question number 3. Did the Chinese women actually benefit from Mao's rule? Or from communist rule, I should say. Now, I did say in class that women's issues and support for the communist movement was an important part of Mao's revolutionary strategy. Because in the 1920s and the 1930s, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek tried to reverse many of the gains that women had gotten, and this brought many women into the communist cause. The nationalists were led by Chiang Kai-shek's wife. The nationalist women's movement was led by Chiang Kai-shek's wife, I should say, and she said that Chinese women should return to the home, and it was immoral to criticize one's husband. And Mao had a different view. Like I said before, Mao said that women held up half the heavens. So in 1949, new marriage laws were issued forbidding arranged marriages because typically the parents would decide who was getting married, who was marrying who. So they forbid arranged marriages. They prohibited marriage contract for the purchase and sale of wives and encouraged the free choice of spouses so that men and women should be allowed to choose who they want to be married rather than their parents telling them who they should marry. In addition, laws were passed banning concubines, we talked about that in class, foot binding, prostitution, and trafficking in women. And actually, with these laws met a lot of strong resistance because China very much was a patriarchal society, and some of these ideas were kind of entrenched. And a lot of people, particularly the men, kind of fought against these laws. Families were very important in China, as we know. They provided old age security for parents as they got older. They provided child care. And the new laws threatened the structure of the family without really providing an alternative to fill those voids. Like, who's going to take care of me when I'm older? Who's going to help me take care of my kids? A lot of these laws were not widely enforced, unfortunately. And the Communist Party leadership did remain mostly male. So women were not becoming leaders within the Chinese Communist Party. But communists did use women to further the communist cause. So they served as teachers, nurses, spies, truck drivers, laborers, and at certain points they were even soldiers on the front lines during the fight for communists to come to power. So the communist revolution did bring, legal equality between men and women. And since 1949, women were expected to work outside the home. And career opportunities for women have improved. Now, in 1949, women made up 7% of the workforce in China. By 1983, it was up to 43%. So that meant that in China, 70% of all women in 1982 were working. In 1953, they were given the right to vote. And literacy rates did increase for men in 78% for men and 60% for women. Now, eventually, to kind of contrast, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Deng Xiaoping, or the effects of this when we talk about Deng Xiaoping, but remember we were talking in class about how the population was increasing because Mao felt that, birth control was capitalist. But in 1979, after Mao's death, the Chinese government does institute the one-child policy to try to slow down birth rates. But what we see as a result of that in China today is a large inequality in between the ratio of men to women, because boys are still favored in China. So what many families would do would either abort their female child, like once we know today now that you can find out the sex of the baby. So they'll find out the sex of the baby, find out it's a girl, and they'll abort the baby girl, or they'll put the baby girl up for adoption. So in 1981, there was 108 men for every 100 women. But think about how big the population of China is, so multiply that by all those times. In 2000, the number had jumped to 110 men for every 100 women. And by 2005, it was 118 men to every 100 women. So the result now is that there are a lot more men in China than women. And that has created a whole nother set of problems. But the next question we're going to talk about is, how did Mao try to keep the revolution alive in China? And so what we're going to talk about now is something that's known as the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 until 1976. And this was like another attempt by Mao, kind of like the Great Leap Forward, in the idea that he wanted to keep up the excitement for the revolution. He felt that people were beginning to grow soft. Um, and he felt that there was a resistance that was beginning to grow of people who were turning against communism. So he wanted to silence the resistance. He wanted to purge the party of bureaucrats that he felt were getting kind of too entrenched in the government. And he wanted to reignite the Chinese revolutionary fervor. And so he wanted to make sure that the education system in China and that the economic reforms that were being made in China were there to completely eliminate capitalism, because he felt that as um, China had progressed from the 1950s, capitalism was making its way back into China, and he wanted to try to get rid of that in any way, shape, or form that he could. And he says, it is up to us to organize the people. This is from 1945, but this idea, this part of the quote I like is, this is also like sweeping the floor. As a rule, where the broom does not reach, the dust will not vanish of itself. So Mao was trying to kind of completely remake Chinese society, get rid of Confucian ideas, get rid of traditional Chinese values, get rid of capitalism. And he felt that if you didn't actively try to seek it out, it was still going to be there, kind of hiding in the corners and the crevices. So he institutes a an emphasis against capitalist inroaders is what he referred to them to. So in schools, people had to teach Mao Zedong thought, which was practical education. Mao published a book. It was called Mao's Little Red Book. It was the most important book in China. It was read publicly throughout the country, so people were forced to listen to the Little Red Book. People would, like I said, you could buy copies of the Little Red Book. I have a copy of it. I'll show you in class. I bought it when I was in China. And so the idea was that, like I said, they wanted to get rid of all elements of capitalism, Confucianism, traditional ideas. So they set up what were called Red Guards. And the Red Guards would go through the country destroying the old culture. They would also go against Mao's political rivals. And essentially, they were armed forces of students. So imagine one day you walked into class and government officials came into class and said, you're no longer going to go to school. Your teacher, I have been denounced. I'm a capitalist inroader, and Mrs. Dearlam has been denounced and has been sent off somewhere. And you are going to go out into the world and make sure that people are following Mao Zedong thoughts and following the ideas of the revolution. So it was basically armed forces of students that were attacking college professors, plant managers, children of government officials, and they were berated and they were forced into confessing their crimes against the people. So, members of the Communist Party were forced to threaten, they were called struggle meetings, and they were forced to confess their crimes against the people. Professors, like I said, plant managers. And these groups then would be forced to do manual labor on communes so they could understand the hardship of the peasants. So like I said, like one day I would just disappear, I would be sent to some, commune in the middle of nowhere and be forced to do the manual labor of a peasant. The Cultural Revolution basically brought the economic and cultural life to China to a complete standstill. Kids weren't being educated. So you have a whole generation of people that didn't get a proper education because they were sent to be these Red Guards. You completely, purged the Communist Party. People who had been loyal communists were forced to kind of denounce and confess to things that they didn't necessarily do. Families were broken up. It really kind of messed up China's development. So as the damage became more visible, then he tried to reverse these policies. But how do you stop something like this? Like it goes on for 10 years, it's kind of taken on a mind of its own. So the People's Liberation Army was given the job of basically suppressing the Red Guards. And so the Chinese government, began also to kind of come out of its isolationism. Remember I said in class that no one really was doing business with China. China kind of isolated itself from the outside world. Well, in 1972, we start to see a normalization process between the United States and China, and we actually formally recognize China. They also tried to focus on restoring industrial productivity. And so we start to see industrial output begin to grow. Um, but in order to make this happen, like I said, they had to basically like go after the Red Guards, who were the ones who were told to start the Cultural Revolution, and those students too were basically sent eventually into the countryside, into communes. But temples had been destroyed, religious sculptures were destroyed. They tore down street signs and replaced them with more revolutionary names. They even wanted to change the street lights so that red meant go, since red is the color of communism. And so you could see some of the propaganda that was coming out of China during the Cultural Revolution. So this is showing, smiling, happy people out in the countryside. Um, the city folk, in a way, kind of like meeting up with the country folk. The the communist holding the little red book of Mao, smashing the capitalist. The mother studying late at night, reading up on Mao's little red book. Um, holding up Mao's ideas and his schools of thought. So these posters would have been all over China during this time period. And Mao was seen as this very, benevolent, loving figure. There was this huge cult of personality around him, but in actuality, he's kind of going after anyone who has any type of opposition against him. So you could see little like Chinese like scouts with the picture of Mao. And remember, I said in Tiananmen Square today, there still is this large picture of Mao, very predominantly hung. This is outside the Forbidden City. So the summary question is, could China have ever had a truly egalitarian society? Could they actually have achieved the goals of what Mao had wanted to accomplish for China? So I want you to think about that. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you guys in class.